Welcome to another in our series of Kehillat Israel podcasts. This is a recording of Rabbi Amy Bernstein's weekly Friday morning Torah study.
We are at Vayakhel-Pekudei. We are at the part where the description of erecting the Mishkan. We got the instructions, how it's supposed to be and look. Now we get those same descriptors in real time as it's happening. So everything repeated again. So I looked at this new, I got one of those nerdy rabbinic messages that said there's a new Haggadah that you have to check out. And I'm always just like, we use the same Haggadah, but I saw it was called Echoes of Egypt. And I was like, what? So y'all know how I love to look at ancient Near Eastern practice and tradition and philosophy and all of that and understand how the Israelites reconstructed that. Well, this new Haggadah is all about how the Israelites took the propaganda of the Egyptian royalty and theology and flipped it on its head and used it to describe the weakness of Egypt and the glory of a God who was about justice and equity and compassion and righteousness and goodness. I don't remember really hearing much about this anywhere. Y'all know I love the stuff about Moses maybe having been, right, a follower of Akhenaten, a prince of Egypt who defects and goes to monotheism and allies with the oppressed. So I love that stuff. I have not ever studied, I don't know why not, literature about the connection between the language in the Haggadah and in Exodus being a complete takeover from Egypt. We'll talk about what that means. Like, I haven't had much time to sit with it. I just read it. I just studied it this week. So we're going to look at that because it directly impacts our understanding of the Mishkan. We've talked before about Sinai being like a ziggurat, right? The temples in the ancient Near East were ziggurats. You know, you had a staircase going up a very steep thing, and the priests went up and met the God at the top of the ziggurat. So that's Sinai for sure. What's the Mishkan? Like, huh? Like, it's not the temple. It's not exactly a temple. So what is it? We are going to read from the Haggadah, this Joshua Berman's analysis of what the Mishkan actually is. So here we have, we're in Vayakhel-Pekudei, a double portion by Ya'as. So we're now talking about making the enclosure. On the south side, 100 cubits of hangings of fine twisted linen for the enclosure with their 20 posts and 20 sockets of copper. The hooks and bands of the posts being silver. So pay attention to the materials. We've gone through this before. If you aren't so familiar with it, listen to podcasts from several years in a row, because we talk about this twice or 4 times, 5 times every year, the Mishkan. Right. On the west side, 50 cubits of hangings with their 10 posts and their 10 sockets, the hooks and bands of the posts being silver. And on the front side, right, we get 15 cubits of hangings on the one flank and their 3 posts and their 3 sockets. We get 15 cubits of hangings on the other flank. All the hangings around the enclosure were of fine twisted linen. So we have fine twisted linen, we have copper, we have silver. Here we have the posts being of copper and we have posts of silver. The overlay on the top was silver. And all the posts of the enclosure were banded with silver. This is a lot of precious metal, right, being used here. The screen of the gate done in embroidery was of blue, purple, and crimson yarns and fine twisted linen. We've talked about the importance of these colors, that they were royal colors because they were so expensive to make. They were extraordinarily expensive. So that's why they're royal colors, because usually only the wealthy, and who's the wealthiest of the wealthy? The king, the queen, right? The royal folk. So it makes sense that if you're building something for God, obviously we're going to use something expensive and precious. So we've known all of this, but I want us to now see it through a slightly different lens. So here we have copper and silver again, and then all of the pegs of the tabernacle and of the enclosure were of copper. So we have it's called Mishkan HaEdut, the Mishkan, the indwelling place. For whom? For God. The Mishkan, the indwelling place, HaEdut, of witness. So here the author is translating that witnessing as being the tablets of witness of our covenant with the divine. And we've talked about the ancient Near Eastern tradition of placing the covenant between a conquering king and the vassal king and its people, placing that agreement in the footstool of the throne of the conquering king. So we've often seen the ark as being the footstool of the throne, because God's presence is going to be on the ark, and we put the agreement between the king and us in the footstool of the king. So we've talked about this before. The kruvim as being the armrests, and of course our God is invisible, so there's no chair, and there's no being. It's right, God's concentrated presence. We've often talked about this from the ancient Near East. Okay, but we're going to talk about it slightly differently today. I'm so excited. All the gold used for the work and all the sanctuary, the elevation offering of gold came to 29 talents and 730 shekels by the sanctuary weight. So a lot of gold. Who gave this gold? The silver of those of the community who were recorded came to 100 talents and 1775 shekels by the sanctuary weight. This comes from the people. All of this stuff is coming from the people. They plundered the Egyptians on their way out. All of this gold and silver and precious stuff is coming from the people. We have Kol Nadiv Lev. We're told everyone of voluntary heart brings forth precious stuff, and then everyone is taxed to bring a half shekel. Everybody has to bring half a shekel. So the Mishkan is built by the things brought by the people, stuff that belonged to the people. And then we get a description of how much all of that is. It's a lot, right? This is an expensive building project and very grand and very intricate with all of its blue, purple, crimson yarns, right? They're also now going to be the service vestments for officiating in the sanctuary. And then we get all descriptions of things like the ephod, the gold, blue, purple, crimson yarns and fine twisted linen. And this means gold thread. They made gold thread out of gold, right? That is a very precise kind of work, and it makes those clothes very expensive because of the color of the dye and how much just a tiny bit of dye costs, and the fact that there's gold thread made from real gold running through it. They hammered out sheets of gold and cut the threads to be worked into designs among the blue, purple, and crimson yarns and the fine linen. Okay, so this is very intricate, very expensive, very specific talents needed for this, and lots of resources of all kinds. So, we get the breastplate, we get these semi-precious stones that are engraved, we've talked about this before, with micro engraving, which was an art form in Egypt. If you think of like the scarabs, the stones that are carved into scarabs, we see a lot of that work still in Egypt, but we see it all over the ancient Egyptian material that archaeologists have discovered, micro engraving on stone and on semi-precious stone as a very, very well-known art form in the ancient Near East and in Egypt. So these are set right in the breastplate, and we have 4 rows of stones, right? So this is a piece of decorative and ritual ornamentation that has a lot of stuff going on and a lot of, it's expensive. It's very expensive and very precious. Right? We have braided chains of corded work in pure gold. That's a lot, y'all. All right. 2, rings of gold, 2 rings at the end, 2 golden cords at the top, So we're getting a sense of how incredibly elaborate all of this is. And the rings are to attach it to the other pieces of ornamentation that the priest is wearing. And then we know that there are pomegranates of blue, purple, and crimson yarn and bells between them. The headdress is of linen. Again, linen is one of the most precious fabrics that took a lot of work to make. It was very precious. And then a frontlet of pure gold on the front, on the forehead of Aharon, on his headdress, on the front of the headdress in pure gold. What does it say? Kodesh Ladonai, holy unto God, meaning set aside, set apart for God only. So these vestments, these garments, this headdress, none of it was to be worn except when Aaron was functioning as high priest. These were only to be worn for Yod-Heh Vav-Heh and sacred avodah, sacred service. They are kodesh, they are set aside. Okay. So we're getting a sense, right, of, wow, this is something, this whole Mishkan, the clothing. Okay. Let's look at Joshua Berman, who says, there is a profound irony at the heart of Jewish memory. The very text that proclaims our liberation from Egypt in the book of Exodus borrows its most majestic imagery from the oppressor's own propaganda. This borrowing is neither accident nor coincidence. It is something far more sophisticated and subversive. The Torah teaches us that the weak need not cower before the symbols of the strong. Instead, it demonstrates how an enslaved people can transform the very language of their oppression into the vocabulary of their liberation. For the book of Exodus exhibits cultural appropriation at its most audacious, taking the monumental account of one pharaoh's most celebrated military triumph and reimagining it as the stage for God's supreme victory over Egypt itself. Okay, so what we're learning is that there is Egyptian propaganda celebrating a pharaoh and his military victory for which he was very well known, and it was all over Egypt, pictorially represented, and that is reimagined as God's triumph over Pharaoh and Pharaoh's army. Okay, we're not going to just take his word for it. He's going to give us proof. What follows is not merely an academic exercise in comparative literature, but a window into the Torah's revolutionary understanding of how meaning is made and remade. In appropriating Egyptian royal rhetoric, our ancestors did not diminish their message, but magnified it immeasurably. They declared that the God of Israel surpassed the mightiest Pharaoh, not by avoiding comparison, but by inviting it and rendering it absurd. In doing so, they created a narrative so compelling that it has sustained a people across millennia, transforming a paean celebrating ancient Egypt's greatest moment of glory into the eternal foundation of Jewish hope. As an example, consider the familiar biblical refrain that God took Israel out of Egypt. This is in the Haggadah, of course, and it's in Exodus, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. The Tanakh could have employed that phrase to describe a whole host of divine acts on Israel's behalf, and yet the phrase is used only with reference to the Exodus. This is no accident. In much of Egyptian royal literature, the phrase mighty hand is a synonym for the pharaoh, and many of the pharaoh's actions are said to be performed through his mighty hand or his outstretched arm. Nowhere else in the ancient Near East are rulers described in this way. What is more, the term is frequently to be found in Egyptian royal propaganda from 1500 to 1100 BCE, meaning the time Israelite ancestors might have been exposed, right? The people that we've talked about maybe living in northern Goshen who are oppressed somehow, the Apitu, the Apiru, the Hebrews, the Ivrim, that then come out and have a desert experience, join up with with folks who are around Canaan and folks who are influenced by Midianite religion, and they become the early Israelites with this shared narrative of an exodus from Egypt. So if I'm going too fast, let me know. Mighty hand and outstretched arm is nowhere in the ancient Near East. Nowhere. But where is it? It's in Egypt, describing Pharaoh and Pharaoh's actions from 1500 to 1100 BCE. I did not know that. Okay, well, that's exciting. Why would the book of Exodus describe God in the same terms used by the Egyptians to exalt their Pharaoh? We see here the dynamics of appropriation. During much of its history, ancient Israel was an Egypt shadow. For weak and oppressed peoples, one form of cultural and spiritual resistance is to appropriate the symbols of the oppressor and put them to competitive ideological purposes, also known as reconstructing a tradition. I believe and intend to show in what follows that in its telling of the Exodus, the Torah appropriates far more than individual phrases and symbols, that in brief, it adopts and adapts one of the best known accounts of one of the greatest of all Egyptian pharaohs. What is that story that it appropriates? Ramses and the Great Battle of Kadesh. Okay? Like all great ancient empires, ancient Egypt waxed and waned. The zenith of its glory was reached during the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1100 BCE. It was then that its borders reached their farthest limits, and many of the massive monuments still visible today were built. The greatest pharaoh of this period was Ramses II, also fittingly known as Ramses the Great, who reigned from 1279 to 1213. Ramses's paramount achievement, which occurred early in his reign, was his 1274 victory over Egypt's arch rival, the Hittite Empire, at the Battle of Kadesh, a town located on the Orontes River on the modern-day border between Lebanon and Syria. Upon his return to Egypt, Ramses inscribed accounts of this battle on monuments all across the empire. 10 copies of these inscriptions exist to this day. These multiple copies make the Battle of Kadesh the most publicized event anywhere in the ancient world, the events of Greece and Rome not accepted. Moreover, the texts were accompanied by a new creation, bas reliefs depicting the battle frame by frame, so that, much as with stained glass windows in medieval churches, viewers illiterate in hieroglyphics could learn about the pharaoh's exploits. What does that have to do with us? Funny you should ask. The tabernacle and the tent of Ramses II. Enter now a long-standing biblical conundrum. Scholars have long searched for a model, a precursor that could have inspired the design of the tabernacle that served as the cultic center of the encampment of the Israelites in the wilderness, a design laid out in exquisite verbal detail in Exodus 25 through 29. Although the remains of Phoenician temples reveal a floor plan remarkably like that of Solomon's temple, built, as it happens, with the extensive assistance of a Phoenician king, no known cultic site from the ancient Near East seemed to resemble the desert tabernacle. Then, some 90 years ago, an unexpected affinity was noticed between the biblical descriptions of the tabernacle and the illustrations of Ramses' camp at Kadesh in several bas reliefs. In the image below, the walled military camp occupies the large rectangular space in the relief's lower half. So this is an actual relief of the battle at Kadesh. Wait till you see this. OMG. Look at this rectangle in the bottom. Do you see the larger rectangle here outlined? I wish I had a pointer, but I don't. So you can see they look like headstones outlining this rectangle. Oh, what's that in the center of the rectangle? That is Ramses's throne room, his war throne room, while the army is encamped. Huh. Really? Yes, really. do you see the smaller rectangle with the people bowing before the throne? Yeah, you see that on the right-hand side? Okay, good. Look how it's divided. Oh, look at that. There's an outer chamber to this innermost throne tent. And then there's a very inner chamber that is the throne itself. And what is that we see in the throne room? Oh, winged thingies on either side of the Pharaoh and the Pharaoh's throne. The camp is twice as long as it is wide. The entrance to it is in the middle of the eastern wall on the left. At the center of the camp, down a long corridor, lies the entrance to a 3-to-1 rectangular tent. This tent contains 2 sections, a 2-to-1 reception tent with figures kneeling in adoration, and leading westward from it, a domed square space that is the throne tent of the Pharaoh. There it is again. You see it on the right, that small rectangle. The outer chamber and the inner chamber all contained in one enclosure. The ratio is 3-to-1. 2 spaces with a ratio of 3-to-1. Does that sound at all familiar to anybody? Am I making it obvious enough? All of these proportions are reflected in the prescriptions for the Mishkan and its surrounding camp. The 2 diagrams below make clear. Here is the battle compound of Ramses II. Here is the tabernacle compound. Look at that. I'm sorry. How did no one ever teach me this? Look at that. The exact same ratio. The battle compound of the king and the tabernacle compound, the innermost, tent for Pharaoh and his throne, and the reception tent. The exact same spatial representation as we have in the actual Mishkan, with the menorah and the incense altar and the showbread all in the reception tent. And then the Holy of Holies, the Ark, where what is there on the top of the Ark? Oh, 2 winged figures, people. OMG. This starts to make a lot of sense to me. This makes so much more sense than any explanation I've ever heard of the Mishkan. Well, of course, if this was all over ancient Egypt, especially at its zenith, all over bas reliefs that we see all over the New Kingdom, celebrating the mightiest Pharaoh's mightiest victory, it makes a lot of sense that if you want to appropriate the oppressor's symbols of power, you appropriate it. And that's exactly what we see here with the Mishkan. I know, I'm like, okay, blows me away. Okay, so let's go on a little. Here's a close-up of the actual inner reception tent and throne tent. The emblem bearing the Pharaoh's name and symbolizing his power is flanked by falcons, symbolizing the god Horus, with their wings spread in protection over him. Okay. In Exodus, the Ark and the Tabernacle is similarly flanked by 2 winged Kruvim, whose wings hover protectively over it. To complete the parallel, Egypt's 4 army divisions at Kadesh would have camped on the 4 sides of Ramses' battle compound. Chapter 2 of the book of Numbers states that the tribes of Israel camped on the 4 sides of the tabernacle compound. The resemblance of the military camp at Kadesh to the tabernacle goes beyond architecture. It is conceptual as well. For Egyptians, Ramses was both a military leader and a divinity. In the Torah, God is likewise a divinity, obviously, but also Israel's leader in battle. The tent of God, the divine warrior, parallels the tent of the Pharaoh, the living Egyptian god poised for battle. What do scholars made of this observation? All agree that no visual image known to us from the ancient record so closely resembles the tabernacle as does Ramses' throne tent. nor is there any textual description of a cultic tent or throne tent in a military camp that matches these dimensions. On this basis, scholars have indeed suggested that the bas reliefs of the Kadesh inscriptions inspired the tabernacle design found in Exodus. The Torah reworked the throne tent ideologically, with God displacing Ramses the Great as the most powerful force of the time. For the Torah, of course, God cannot be represented in an image and requires no protection, and pagan deities have no standing, which is why instead of falcons and Horus, we have Kruvim hovering protectively over the ark, bearing the tablets of his covenant with Israel. So they are not protecting God. God doesn't need protecting. They are protecting instead the covenant, the sign of the covenant between the deity, the king, who is the king, and who is the warrior king, and the people. All right. So this, we could go on and on, which I could do this for another 3.5, 4 hours with no problem. But I want to say more about what the meaning is of taking this. Like, what does it do to, how is this revolutionary? So he goes through all the parallels of the Song of the Sea, there was a song composed for the Battle of Kadesh, and it matches very closely elements in the Song of the Sea. So the Song of the Sea, after God wins the battle against Egypt, and not one of them survives, parallels exactly the poetry written to celebrate Pharaoh's victory at the Battle of Kadesh, at which not one of the Hittite enemies survived. They all drown. Really? Interesting. This is imagery of Seti the First. With a mighty hand, he holds his captives, and with an outstretched arm goes to smite them with a mitre. This is the mighty hand and outstretched arm of the Pharaoh. How is that revalued, reconstructed by Israel? And how is all this business, I want to go past the song, how is all this business of taking over this imagery revolutionary? All right, well, let's look. And this is something from the Haggadah. This is all from the Haggadah. Here's the Seder order from the Haggadah. I can't wait for it to come in the mail. I'm so excited. And these are some sample pages from the Haggadah, and more parallels between ancient Egyptian mythology and religion and Torah. And this runs throughout the Haggadah. So it was evening and it was morning the sixth day. Even that is reflected in Egyptian religion and mythology. So it's very exciting. Okay, but I want to stay with our incredibly, there it is, Echoes of Egypt, in case you want to get it. All right. So if we look at the throne room war tent as the model of the tabernacle, and the ancient Israelite writers and thinkers and religious leaders took that image on purpose to turn it on its head and use it against Egypt, and understanding Egypt as the major power in the region and Pharaoh as the most powerful king. If they want to use that and declare God the king, what else are they doing when they make this move? Well, if we look at Pharaoh's war tent, it was a mobile royal palace used during campaigns. What is the tabernacle? The portable sanctuary during Israel's wilderness journey. What else is Pharaoh's war tent? The center of authority in the camp. What is the Mishkan? The center of divine presence in Israel's camp. Pharaoh's war tent is surrounded by ordered ranks of soldiers. What is the Mishkan surrounded by? The ordered tribes of Israel. So Israel's camp mirrors a royal encampment that they knew from all of these reliefs and all the stories told about these battles. But God is the king at the center, not Pharaoh. All right, so the first move is to use this to say, what is the power that makes for these victories? It is not, in fact, a human warrior. It is, in fact, Yud-Heh Vav-Heh. That is a radical move. Dissociating a human ruler from the deity. That is a radical revolutionary move in the ancient world. We've talked a little bit about this from the Near East. But now let's look at it from the Egyptian point. Like, what if it's also from Egypt? Okay, the sacred hierarchy of space. It goes even further. There were graded levels of access. In the war tent hierarchy, the outer camp was for soldiers. Who do we have on the courtyard, right? On the outer things of the Mishkan? The Israelites. Your regular Amcha. The next move in is the royal tent area for officers. Well, how does that parallel the Mishkan? The Mishkan that inner tent area could only be entered by the priests and the Levites. The inner chamber was for the king and whoever the king invited in. This, of course, is the Holy of Holies, and only Aharon and Moshe are able to enter that, to be with the king. All right. So there's increasing sanctity and restriction the closer you get to the throne. That is exactly the setup of the Mishkan. At the center, the elite guards protected the king's tent, and access to it was tightly controlled. We're told, of course, in Numbers, the Levites guarded the sanctuary. Unauthorized entry is forbidden. Go one step further. What happened to unauthorized people who came in? They were killed by the Levites. That is pretty tough security. Not only are you not allowed in, but if you violate that boundary, you were killed. All right. Egyptian royal tents were richly decorated with precious metals, embroidered fabrics, symbolic creatures, and elaborate furnishings. What did we just pay good attention to in our text? Gold, silver, and bronze, embroidered curtains, the imagery of kruvim, finely crafted furniture. Remember, it's all overlaid with gold. This is essentially a throne room in tent form. Exactly what we see for Pharaoh when Pharaoh is on a military campaign. In ancient war camps, the king sat on a throne inside the inner chamber, just as the Ark of the Covenant sits in the Holy of Holies, and the kruvim form a throne-like seat because we have the kaporet, the covering of the ark with the kruvim over it. And the ark functions as the invisible throne of Israel's divine king. So this is a reversal of Egyptian political theology, right? This is a political theological inversion. In Egypt, Pharaoh is the divine king. Pharaoh is both divine and depicted with the god hugging and kissing the Pharaoh, displaying chosenness. Chosenness by the god. Who's chosen? Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is the divine king. Who is the divine king in Israel? God alone. The war tent centers the power of Pharaoh. The tabernacle, the Mishkan, centers the presence of God. In Egypt, in that model, the subjects serve the ruler. We have the exact same thing, except it's Israel serving God. So the structure of imperial power that we see in the Egyptian war tent is repurposed, reconstructed into a structure of covenantal worship. Now, we've been studying Leon Kass. What does he do with this? He suggests that the Exodus transforms the political architecture of empire into the architecture of holiness. Israel is organized like a royal army, but its ruler is not human. The center is God's presence, not political power. The former slaves now march through the wilderness as the retinue of a divine king. In short, the tabernacle deliberately resembles Pharaoh's war tent, a portable royal palace, but the Torah subverts the model. Instead of housing an earthly ruler, the tent houses the invisible God who liberated Israel from Pharaoh. But what else is going on, right? If this is Pharaoh's palace, In Egypt, the king himself was considered divine. The palace or royal tent existed to magnify Pharaoh's own sacred status. Pharaoh's the invisible God. The palace centers on the body of the king, is the visible God. The palace centers on the body of the king. The political power and divinity merge. What happens in the Mishkan? It radically overturns this model. No human king sits in the sanctuary. The Holy of Holies is empty, except for the ark. God's presence is invisible and unrepresentable. The throne exists, but the king cannot be seen. What is the overturning of the meaning? Israel's political order rejects the idea that any human ruler is divine. Right. We paid good attention to where did this stuff come from? The splendor of Egyptian royal structures came from forced labor, imperial taxation, and slave exploitation. The palace expresses coerced power, as does the pyramids, as does all of those huge edifices that were, which was, we know there was indentured servitude in Egypt. We know that. It's all over the place. Slaves, people who were captured, people who were subjugated, were all pressed into service of building huge monuments to the human divine king. So the palace expresses Pharaoh's ability to harness forced labor. That's one of the ways he shows off how powerful he is. What's the Mishkan? We're told over and over and over the Mishkan is built from voluntary gifts. Take from every person whose heart moves them. Nadiv, Lave. I never really got why that was so important. I mean, yes, it makes sense that that's important. But if you understand this as appropriating pharaonic propaganda, this turns it completely on its head. Not only are we not proud of the fact that people would have been pressed into giving and building this, it must be voluntarily. The center of Israel's society is built not through domination, but through generosity and consent. What else does it express? Pharaoh's palaces and temples, including his war palace, the portable palace, would have Egyptian architecture symbolized distance, massive monuments, elevated structures, separation between ruler and subjects. The ruler lives above and apart from the people. What is the Mishkan designed explicitly for? To be portable, moving with the people. It sits at the very center of the camp. And what is its purpose? According to Exodus 25:8, V'shachanti betocham, that I might dwell in their midst. A complete reversal of what those tents and structures and throne palaces and rooms would have been about. God is not a distant emperor, but instead is present within the life of the people. So what are some of the things, according to Cass, that we see? Exodus turns the structure of empire inside out. From a divine king to an invisible God, from forced labor to free gifts, from a monumental palace to a portable sanctuary, from power over people to presence among the people. The same royal architecture and symbolism, right, is there, but its meaning is transformed. Pharaoh's tent displays domination. The tabernacle expresses covenant. Right? Okay.
Brilliant.
Talk to me, people. Rachel's got a hand up. Talk to me.
I've always thought that, there was this whole thing of 10 years ago where some scholar was saying that we had never been in Egypt and there's no archaeological proof. To me, this is proof of Egypt. And I sure wish I knew that guy's name because I'd send him the nasty letter I always meant to.
There you go. All right. So this is definitely evidence that there was an Israelite experience of Egypt of some kind, and that we preserved it in a completely inside-out form, appropriated that propaganda, and used it for a radical new message in the ancient world. Usually I say the ancient Near East. Now I'm going to have to fix how I talk about it, because this convinces me that the Mishkan business is an Egyptian concept that was very well known all over Egypt and celebrated and depicted all over Egypt, that the Israelites took and completely revolutionized. All right, Rachel?
Thank you. So I put a pin in that notion of gradations of access. It's just a small point. But this idea that there are these levels, Israelites, and then, right, okay. But one of the ways that the ancient Israelites flip everything on its head is also we're a nation of priests. And if you fast forward to much later and look at what happens to Aaron's sons, even the priests who are allowed into, who get closest to that inner sanctum, even they are not really and truly above anyone else, because if they do something wrong,
boom.
So I feel like that's just another example of how even in the ranking, there isn't really ranking, because it's not just, it's not, common people, officers, and then those with the allowed access to the innermost royal sanctum. It really is but even the guys who are at the top, something goes wrong and poof.
So the gradations of access is mirrored, but I hear what you're saying. It's also a revolutionary thing to keep order of access, right? So God, priests, Levites, Israelites. However, the message is, who do the warrior guards serve? Pharaoh, the divine king, and protect Pharaoh against any encroachment or danger from any of those citizens of Egypt. Right. Who do the priests serve?
The people.
They serve on behalf of the people.
It's to, right. I mean, it seems like what they're protecting, that, the people from having something like that happen to them, because.
Correct. They take the risk
nuclear, right?
For the firstborn. It was supposed to be the firstborn of every Israelite household that was dedicated to God. It gets flipped into, not only do they have closer access, they are put at greater risk.
And danger. So
that regular Israelites are not at risk. That is a complete turning. Because you can imagine the people with swords who are standing outside Pharaoh's throne room are ready to turn those swords on the people. At any given moment, they can turn them on the people. In our situation, the Levites are taking the risk of getting close to the throne room on behalf of the people, so the people are protected and are never put at risk. Okay. Lisa?
Oh, I mean, yeah, this is so mind-blowing, because I also bought the whole thing that we were never in Egypt. But I mean, this is pretty clear. I mean, we didn't mimic something from Babylonia or some other part of the ancient Middle East. It's Egypt. But I'm so struck by the difference between the notion of Ramses with his mighty, mighty hand, which we repeat every year, as a hand of military might, and that image of, holding somebody you're about to kill, with our concept of the hand of God redeeming an entire people. I mean, that's a completely different image of a hand outstretched. It's absolutely beautiful.
Beautiful. Isn't it beautiful?
Yeah, it blows me away.
It makes me appreciate it so much more to know that they would have known that image as an image of physical dominance by a human king who was perceived of as having divine power to annihilate whoever they wanted to with one blow, and that's what was celebrated, and that exact same language used to describe the freeing of a bunch of slaves and the granting of the status of being a holy people and a nation of priests. That same imagery, that's what Israelites understood
Yeah.
a mighty hand and outstretched arm to be about, and what their God was about, that is like mind-blowing.
Also, the incredible enormity of replacing this idea of a physical God embodied in a human being, Ramses. You take that away, and all of a sudden, the political order really is changed, because who fills the void? Human beings in search of a God, an invisible God. I mean, it really is kind of mind-blowing. It really
It's
is.
amazing.
But the thing is, it also makes you realize what a step back Christianity is in reinvesting in a human God. It's like,
Yes.
yeah, whatever. I mean, I'm not even going to
Well,
go there.
I'm going to say they never left it.
Yeah, perhaps.
They never left it. The pagans who converted to Christianity had to have an embodied
That
God.
notion already.
They
Yeah.
had to. So that's why Christianity made that move of making Jesus divine. That wasn't always the case. Jesus people were different from Christ
They were
people.
Jews.
Well, there were Jews, but there were
Originally.
Jesus. Listen to me. I took intro to deep Christianity. Originally, there were followers of Jesus of Nazareth. Some were Jews, some were not. There were other people in the region who believed in the risen Christ, the King who dies on behalf of the people every year and is resurrected. At some point, those two groups come together, and Jesus becomes the risen Christ.
Yeah, I got it.
Right? So the pagans are satisfied with that shift. Some pagans couldn't leave and become Jesus people. Some Jews did, but some pagans couldn't until they had Jesus as the risen Christ, the King.
Mm.
So they just never left it. It stayed,
Mm.
along with all the rituals associated with it that we see in the temple that are now in the church that we left right behind when we made yet another revolutionary move to say God is not in a temple more prominently than God is anywhere else, and we worship God at the altar of our table in our home.
Right.
That's the radical move of rabbinic Judaism coming out of biblical Israel. I do want to just, before I call on Bert, I do want to say one thing. I have never argued that there was not a Jewish experience of Egypt. Never.
Yes.
What I have argued always is that it is not the dominant experience of our Israelite ancestors, and all of them came out of Egypt and conquered the Holy Land and took it from the natives. That is not what history tells us. What I've always taught, and maybe I haven't been clear enough, this is how I was taught at rabbinical school. There was a group of Semites
Yes.
living in northern Egypt who were migrant workers, Apiru, that we call Hebrew. The Apiru at some point become oppressed by the ruling Pharaoh, and there is famine where they come from as migrant workers, so they can't go home. They can't go back to the Levant because there's no rain. It's a drought. The Nile feeds agriculture in Egypt. So they stayed in Egypt because there was starvation happening in Canaan. That is all over our Genesis narrative. That group at some point pushes out of northern Egypt, maybe has a battle with a pharaoh to get out. We don't know, but leaves and has an experience in the desert with a God called Yahweh. Moses marries the high priest, the daughter of the high priest of Midian. So perhaps this group who comes out of Egypt hooks up with a group of folks who are Midianite, who have a tradition of a desert God who lives in the desert mountain of Sinai. The sound of that God moving through desert caves is Yahweh, Yahweh, which we talked about at the women's retreat. All right. That makes sense to me. Those groups coalesce. Those groups push into northern Israel and begin taking small cities in northern Israel, influencing the Canaanites there who are oppressed by their overlords, And those Canaanites understand and receive and identify with what the Israelites have done with all of this imagery, turning it on its head and empowering the people. So they convert to Yahwism. In the ancient world, whoever the conquering God is, you just switch, which is why there's so much ancient Near Eastern stuff all over our early theology and early symbolism, because you had to serve the converted Canaanites lest Israel backslide and go back to worshiping Asherah and Baal, which was always their temptation. Okay, does that make sense? That happened slowly over time, more and more Israelite and Yahwist influence over converting Canaanites until we have the ancient empire of Israel. Northern and southern Israel, a loose confederation of 12 tribes who come together during national emergency and eventually under David form a nation state called Israel. The United Monarchy, which lasted how long? Do we remember?
50 years?
100 years.
100 years.
That's it. Okay. So that is my understanding of our experience in Egypt. What I love about this is that it really does lift up that whatever our ancestors' experience in Egypt was, it was a brilliant move to use this imagery against the idea of Egyptian power and against the idea of empire being about human ruling. But I also want to remind us, where is Kadesh? Where was the Battle of Kadesh? Right? Thank you, Rachel. At the border of Lebanon and Syria. That is not in Egypt. That is in the Levant, people. That's northern Israel. Right? So this whole celebrated victory that we get all of these representations of all over Egypt happened north of Israel. You don't have to be in Egypt to be exposed to the battle at Kadesh. The Israelites were in the region where that battle happened, and Egypt reigned supreme in Israelite territory. Okay? Okay. Bert and then Betsy.
Do you think that this was intentional? That these former slaves who we think it took 40 years for them to get mentally out of slavery actually intentionally did this?
Intentionally did what?
Reconstructed it, made the association and decided, I've got a great idea. Let's use the Egyptian thing and let's reframe it. Or was, after 400 years of slavery, assuming there was slavery, and it's so confusing now as to what there was and what there wasn't, or was this for them the only way that things were done? And if they were going to do their thing, they were going to have to do it within this framework because that was the framework that you did. So
in any culture, I think you have both of those happening all the time. You can't say were our forefathers, did they in America create the Constitution because all they knew was a constitutional monarchy? Like what? All they knew was yes, and yes, and no, and sort of. And there's new stuff coming in. But of course, they only have one frame of reference, which is what they've known. But they're going to radically change what it means and what it looks like of the people, for the people, by the people. That is the move of ancient Israel. Do they use the symbolism they're familiar with? Of course. But is it also purposeful to say, I'm not going to pick a new one. We're going to pick the one that they use for this message, and we're going to turn that on its head? Yeah. Right? So I think all of that's going on. And in any culture, it's very hard to say what art is influenced by what, whatever, what's new, what's revolutionary, what's really, it's in the region, so you've been exposed to it, so you're influenced by it. I think it's all happening, but I think it's just way more clear that the authors of the Mishkan texts are 100% reconstructing Pharaoh's throne tent during war that was made famous by the Battle of Kadesh in north of Israel. Okay, Betsy?
So how and when did the story of the Jews building
building the pyramids arise? Because
So
it didn't seem like that happened.
we don't have a story of Jews building pyramids.
So why
That's-
is it in all the
It's
Haggadot?
because it's wrong. That is not what Torah says. Torah says we built the storehouse cities of Pitom and Ramses.
Okay. So who invented this story of the
That might be accurate. That Apiru labor was used to build the royal storehouse cities of Pitom and Ramses. You would use labor from people coming in who are starving in the Levant. They're migrant workers. They're looking for work. They have no food. They come down and they work. If that's how our ancestors got to Goshen, which is the theory, and that's what we're told in Genesis. There's a famine in Canaan, so they go to Goshen. We know that this happened a lot. The Levant was having a famine. They would go to Goshen where there was food, and they would be workers there.
But I thought that the timing of the building of the pyramids, like, that doesn't coincide with when the Jews were supposedly, or our ancestors were supposedly there. Like, so
Because they have nothing to do with the pyramids.
right, that's what I understand. So I'm trying to understand how
We
that
have nothing to do with the pyramids. Pyramids
Right.
mean nothing to
right.
us.
But how did that come about? That story,
I
that
don't know.
invention.
Because the pyramids were built by slave labor.
So
So if we were slaves in Egypt,
then
people make
obviously
a jump and a leap that is not in our text.
Yeah. But I mean, has that been like forever that leap was made? And
I don't know. I mean, I grew up with it,
yeah, well, we all did. I'm
but it's
sure.
not true.
Right.
The storehouses of Pitom and Ramses would have been built with labor, like who picks our strawberries? People whose families are starving.
Migrant
So they
labor.
come here as migrant workers and send money home. That's exactly what our ancestors would have been.
Yeah.
People who came into Goshen as migrant workers and somehow get stuck there because they can't go home, and they become an oppressed class. That happens here.
Right. But
All the
somewhere
time.
along the way, somebody decided to say it was the pyramids and not the storehouses that these
Yes.
laborers built.
Yes.
And I have one other question. Do you think that some of the ornate elements of churches came from this idea from ancient Egypt of, the gold and all the elaborate decorations?
I think it's back to Bert's question. I think every royal whatever would have been influenced by who's the most important, what does their palace look like? It's like, of course. And the human instinct towards, if it's going to be the most important building, then it better have our most precious materials used to make it. I think that's a terrestrial human culture issue. And yes, of course they saw it around them in Egypt and in the ancient Near East. But again, Aaron's turban with a gold thing on it has a whole different meaning if you're talking about that being the throne tent. Who's wearing the crown? Not the God. The servant of the divine is wearing the crown, who serves the people. He takes their offerings and offers them to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. The person wearing the crown in our story serves the people on behalf of the people. All right, Susan?
No, I loved your phrase terrestrial human culture, because then I started thinking about extraterrestrial human culture, and I started thinking about Jews in space and Babylon 5.
Love it. Love it. Well, Jews in space is all over Babylon 5, as we know. We know, like all of us know, that Babylon 5 is totally based on Jewish history. 100%. Okay, which is why I couldn't watch some of it. It was so hard because it was so Holocausty. I couldn't watch some parts of that season. I couldn't watch.
And Susan, the second-in-chief commander, is Jewish.
Of course. All right, people, that was amazing. Thank you for hanging with me. I know that was a lot in an hour, but I got to tell you, it's going to change some things for me forever, I think, about Seder, about Mishkan, about all this stuff. And we'll just have to see how that unfolds for us as a community over time, what our relationship to this new idea is. But But I'm excited to find something new in texts that we've been studying for so long is always so exciting. Turn it and turn it and turn it, for everything is in it. There's always something new, right? So here it is.
You've been listening to Rabbi Amy Bernstein's Friday Morning Torah Study from Kehillat Israel in Pacific Palisades, California. For more information, go to our website, www.ourki.org.